We are moving on to aorist or perfective participles. And so we're going to take a look first at the rules for forming aorist tense participles. Then we'll work through some examples of participles. So forming first aorist participles as opposed to second aorist, we'll look at second aorist in a minute. So for first aorist participles, we begin with the first aorist tense stem. There's no augment. We have a tense formative, which in the active and middle voices is sa, sigma alpha, and in the passive is the, theta epsilon. There's a participle morpheme. For the active, it is nu tau, and it's sa for the feminine. The middle is the same as we saw for the presence. It's mena or mene. And for the passive, we have the nu tau again, and then for the feminine, we have isa. So that would be iota sigma alpha. And if we combine the tense formative and the participle morpheme, for masculine and neuter, we get thent, and for feminine, we get thesa. We'll see some examples of that. The case ending is the same as for present tense. And that means that for the masculine, neuter active, and also masculine and neuter passive, we're going to see third declension. And then for the feminines, in all the voices, we're going to see first declension, but active, passive, first declension. And then for the middles, for the masculine and the neuter, we're going to see second declension. And this is similar to what we saw for the present tense. For middle passive, this is just middle. This will be second declension, and then feminine will be first declension. And again, all voices are first declension for feminine. So in Mounce's book, this is in sections 28.5 through 28.10. So let's look at section 28.7 of Mounce's textbook. This is the first aorist active participles. He calls perfective. And often it's a good idea to look at the genitives first. We have the tense formative sa, then we have the participle morpheme nu tau, and then we have all the way down, we have the standard third declension endings, sa, as, e, a, s, on, sin, as. The nominative singular, that nt drops out, and we just are left with the sigma. But at least the third declension ending is normal. For the feminines, we have the aorist tense formative, the sa, and then we have this interesting participle morpheme where the nu tau turns into another sa. So we have lusasa and lusases and lusase and lusasa and lusasan. Sounds like a foreign language, but these are not difficult to recognize, and that's really the main thing. We have first declension endings here, and again, we have the alpha, eta, eta, alpha pattern that's true for some first declension nouns. And then for the plurals, the endings are normal. So I, own, ice, as. Then the neuter is just normal third declension. For memorization, you want to take a look at the nominative singulars and the genitive singulars. Those are the ones that you want to memorize. And now section 28.9, this is the first aorist middle participles, perfective. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this. It's the same tense formative, the sa, and then we have this very nice men showing up in all of these forms, all the way across the table. So masculine, feminine, neuter. And these are quite helpful for us to figure out that these are middle. So the sa and the men together tell us it's aorist middle. As with present tense, we're looking at second declension and second declension for masculine and neuter, and then first declension for feminine. So the endings, as, u, o, an, just what we expect for second declension. Same with neuters, an, u, o, an, and all the way on down. And then for the feminines, these are our nice eta endings, a, ace, a, ane, and then the plurals are our normal first declension endings. And again, you want to look at the nominative singular and genitive singulars in terms of memorization. Finally, let's look at the first aorist passive participles. This is section 28.10. Here it's a good idea to look at the genitive singular. Here is our tense formative the and our participle morpheme nu tau. So thent is what we get. And we'll see thent pretty much all the way through, all the way down, except for the dative again, because that sigma causes some interesting things to happen because the tau drops out. So for the nominative, we still have the the as our tense formative, but the nu tau drops out and then the epsilon lengthens to epsilon iota, so we get luthase. So that's just one that you need to memorize. The feminines, we have the the comes up against the isa. That actually looks pretty normal, thesa. And then we have the first declension endings here. And the neuters are just normal third declension. And again, the nominative singular and the genitive singulars are the ones to focus on for memorization. Let's look at some first aorist examples. So we have pistusas. So an aorist active participle, nominative masculine singular from pistuo. And so we have the characteristic sa, and then our sigma, which comes from third declension, and that's the masculine, s, as, I, a. So we have pistu plus the sa. The nt drops out in this case, and then we attach the third declension ending directly onto it. Next we have apalusasa, and here we have this nice sasa, which looks a lot like a nominative feminine singular. So we have apalu plus sa, and a null, which would be our nominative. But normally it's simpler just to look at an a as the nominative feminine singular ending. This comes from the verb apaluo. Then we have paruthentes. Well, the thent is telling us aorist passive, so aorist passive participle. This is from paruamai. I didn't put that down, but it's paruamai. We have paru plus the, tense formative, plus the nu tau participle morpheme, plus s is the nominative masculine plural third declension ending. Let's now look at the second aorist, active and middle. So the second aorist tense stem has no augment. The rest of this is pretty much like the present tense. The connecting vowel, omicron, same as the present tense. The participle morpheme will be the same as for present tense, either nu tau or usa. For the middle, it will be mena or mene, and the case ending is the same as present tense. So there are not a lot of surprises here. We've already seen all of this. The only difference is the second aorist tense stem. And now let's look at second aorist passive. So we have the second aorist tense stem, a connecting vowel epsilon, the participle morpheme either nu tau or isa for feminine. When those are combined, we have ent for masculine and neuter, and asa for feminine. Then the case ending is going to be the same as present tense. Now let's look briefly at the second aorist active participles. This is section 28.12. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this because these are essentially equal to the present tense except for the second aorist stem. Everything else looks just like what you'd see in the present tense. Third declension, first declension, third declension. The endings are going to look the same as you saw for the present tense. So here we have the second aorist middle participles. And just like the present middle passive, these have the exact same construction. The only difference is that the second aorist stem is different than the present stem. So we don't need to go through all of these. As for the presents, we have our masculine second declension, feminine first declension, and neuter second declension. So everything else is the same as the present middle passive other than the stem. For section 28.14, we need to pay a little more attention here. The second aorist passives are kind of their own world. So looking at the genitive singular, we notice that we have the combination connecting vowel and tense formative, ent, plus the third declension endings, saas, ia, es, on, sinas. So for aorist passive, we have third declension for masculine and neuter and first declension for feminine. And so you need to take a look at these. The genitive is a little more diagnostic. The ent, you see that ent showing up everywhere except again for the dative plural, where that sigma in the ending interacts with the tau in the tense formative and creates some issues. But here we just see the epsilon lengthening to an epsilon iota and the tau and the noon dropping out. For the feminines, the new tau becomes isa, iota sigma alpha. The forms to master are the nominative singulars and the genitive singulars. Now let's look at some examples here. We have graphes. The ace is cluing me in that we're looking at an aorist passive. And grapho is treated like second aorist even though the stem doesn't change. This will be a nominative masculine singular. In this case, the new tau drops out and then the e lengthens, so we get graphes. Genamenes, so here is an aorist middle participle. We got that nice men, which is telling me middle. Gen is going to be my second aorist stem, and then ace is telling me that I'm looking at a genitive. So gena plus mene plus sigma, and you can think of ace as that genitive feminine singular ending. Balusa. So this comes from balo. Since one of the lambdas is dropped out, we know this is a second aorist stem. And then we see that we've got this usa, and it's an aorist active participle. This is going to be nominative feminine singular. This ending looks just like the present tense. So we just have balu, sa, the null ending. And finally, we have graphesi. This is similar to the first one, and it's an aorist passive participle. It's nominative feminine plural. So we have the second aorist stem, the epsilon connecting vowel, and then the participle morpheme. Finally, the ending, and we get graphesi. So a few helpful hints. Again, if we see ant or sant plus a case ending, we're looking at an active participle. In the case of ant, it's a present or second aorist. In the case of sant, it's a first aorist. The men is a pointer to middle, and depending on the tense, it could be a middle passive. And samen points to first aorist middle. And then we have thent and ent, and those are pointing us to aorist passive, either thent first aorist or ent second aorist. So the meaning of the aorist participle in terms of aspect, the standard definition is that aorist participles have perfective aspect. This is looking at the action as a whole, perhaps undefined or perhaps from an outside perspective. So the action is occurring without a sense of process. And this definition, of course, is subject to context. Let's take a look at a verse that's got some aorist participles in it. We're going to look at a verse that's in the workbook exercises for a Basics of Biblical Greek workbook, and it's in chapter 28, and it's number 2. And the workbook only has the last part of the verse, but I've included the whole thing because it's got another participle in it, and it has some interesting features that I think will be helpful to look at. So we'll look at the entire verse of Acts 21:7 here. So let me just read it. Hemes de ton plun dianusantes apaturu katen tesamen eis Ptolemaida, kai aspasamonoi tous adelphus emenamen hemeron mian par autois. It starts out with hemes de, so and we, or but we, and then we have ton plun, which is a journey, typically a sea journey, and then we have dianusantes. This is a nice aorist participle. We've got that sant in there, which is diagnostic of an aorist active participle. And then the S ending for third declension, that's telling us that it's a nominative masculine plural. And it comes from dianuo, which means to complete in the context of completing an activity or arriving at some place, like at the end of a journey. And I mentioned it's an aorist active participle. All right, so ton plun here, the definite article is telling us that it could either be nominative neuter singular or accusative neuter singular. And if it ends up being the direct object of our participle here, then it's going to be accusative neuter singular. I think that's what's going to happen. So we have the journey completing, if I translate that with an ing sense. And I might say here, after completing the journey. So ton plun is a direct object of the verbal idea in this participle, completing the journey or after completing the journey. Apaturu, from Tyre, they sailed from Tyre. And then we have our finite verb here. This is an aorist active indicative. First plural from katantao, and katantao means to meet or to arrive. The idea here is we arrived, simple aorist active here. So I think the entire sense so far is going to be, but we, after completing the journey from Tyre, arrived eis Ptolemaida, at Ptolemaeus or to Ptolemaeus. So we have an adverbial participle, the participle after completing the journey, we arrived. The participle is acting like an adverb for the finite verb we arrived. Then the rest of it, we also have another participle here, aspasamonoi, and this looks like the men is telling us that it's middle. The sa is definitely aorist, so samen, aorist middle. This comes from aspazomai, which means to welcome or to greet. And the ending here, the oi, this is also going to be nominative masculine plural. This is second declension because it's middle. Remember, the middle participles use second declension. So the oi is that nominative masculine plural, second declension ending. And this is again an aorist middle participle. But the lexical form aspazomai means it's deponent, and so probably we're looking at an active meaning here. Greeting, tous adelphus, the brothers. And then we have another finite verb here, and this is another aorist active indicative, first plural from meno, to abide or to remain. And so this is just going to be we remained or we stayed. and then hemeron, a day, meon, one day, par autois, with them. So we have another adverbial participle. After greeting the brothers, we remained one day with them. This is a good example of a couple of adverbial participles working with main verbs. So we have, and we, after completing the journey from Tyre, arrived to or at Ptolemais. And after greeting the brothers, we stayed one day with them.